public hearing. I'll roll just a few seconds here. Give everyone a chance to get tuned in, turned on. Okay, so I'll just start in the middle of the pack here. Councillor McKean.
I am here.
Good day. Councillor Nicol.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Paquette.
Hello.
Hello. Councillor Walters.
I'm present.
Super. Councillor Banga.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Cartmel.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Councillor Caterina.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Zadig.
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Essinger.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Hamilton.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Councillor Henderson.
I'm here.
Good afternoon. And Councillor Knack.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Okay, so we're continuing on with the North Glenora item. I believe we finished hearing from speakers, and then it recessed until now. So we'll pick up with questions of administration now. Have we got a speakers list going for that one? Does the ward councillor wish to go first?
I'm happy to defer to Councillor Knack.
Okay, Councillor Knack, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm happy to. Okay.
Well, Councillor McKean had his mouth full
Fair enough. Okay.
of Breton bites, I think. So go ahead, Councillor Knack.
Thank you.
You were also
Sorry,
snacking.
I can't stay on camera. I was hoping to be downstairs, but there's too many people, so I only brought my phone and it's charging. So instead of having a shaky cam, I'm just going to be off camera for the rest of
No
the
worries. Understood.
show
Carry
today.
on.
I missed that. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
I said that's okay. Carry on.
Thank you. A few questions. So there's a few different topics that have been raised throughout the public hearing. First, I want to understand, is part of the recommendation of support related to the ability, and I think it is talked about in the report, but this is a site that, as per the residential infill guidelines, would in fact support RF3. Is that correct?
That is correct, Councillor Knack. It is across the street from a school and park site.
So that, because I have heard some different comments about that, but whether it is a park or a school, the infill guidelines for, I think, close to 15 years have typically allowed for RF3 zoning. That's correct? That
is correct, yes.
Okay. So that is why in the recommendation you include that as part of your table, and you're comparing both RF1, RF3 to this DC2. So I think one of the other major questions then, and I think it's a very fair one, because this is a different built form than those other two would allow for. And we've heard from the next door neighbor specifically related to privacy, sun shadowing. And so I'm going to start with sun shadowing. The way I've read the report, and again, I'd like to make sure if I'm misunderstanding it, is that this built form, because the maximum height is less than what is available in the other two zones, it actually has less of an impact, even though it's a slightly longer wall, because that last unit is 5.5 meters. So the net impact is actually lower for sun shadowing here than it is on an RF3 or RF1. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, the impact's actually just shifted. So while exactly what you said, with the last unit being reduced in height to 5.5 meters as a step back from the rear yard, just to make sure that we protect that same rear setback as the RF1 would require. So you get a shadow impact that's just shifted over. So while you would have a larger or a break in the buildings previously between the garage and the building in an RF1, sorry, not previously, but in the RF1 setting, in this situation, you don't have a garage building, you just have a longer building, but it does drop in the height to 5.5 meters from 8.25, which again is less than what would be allowed in the RF1 zone.
And so that's why I want, so it's your suggestion that they're the same, because my thought is that, and I just want to make sure I'm clear on this, is that because you could have an 8.9 meter home 1.2 meters from the property line, this is an 8.25 meter home 3 meters from the property line. Let's separate the garage conversation and the other addition, but from that context, that means that would be less, at least for the principal structure, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So then let's assume, because I think part of the way that we're interpreting this is that this 5.5 meter home could have been, if in an RF1 or an RF3, could have been built as a garden suite, which has a maximum height of 6.5 meters.
That is correct.
So that's why when I was looking at that, because this is 5.5 meters, although it's attached to the other portion, a 6.5 meter structure would actually have, because of the height and again the distance, the ability to have it closer to the property line. The way I had read through this is it looked like it was actually a net lower impact, specifically regarding sun shadow. I want to talk about privacy and everything else later, but is that fair?
That would be a fair assessment if you consider that the heights are lower than both allowable structures in the RF1.
Lower and a further distance from what would be permitted. And I want to just double check on the last piece, because I think you mentioned it in the presentation. The RF3, if it's flanking the property, would have a 3 meter setback, but if it was built sort of facing the street, is it still required on a 3 meter setback for the RF3, or is that 1.2 if it's not facing the avenue but facing the street?
If it was flanking the street, it would be a 2 meter setback.
2 meter setback, okay. I think I'm out of time, so I'll have to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Knack. Councillor McKean?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, Ms. Mickelson, Councillor Knack went through a bunch of permutations and combinations there. But your report concluded with support for this project. Is it fair to say that the sun shadow impacts are not seen then as extreme by your crew?
That is fair. Any new development or any development is going to have a shadow impact. The reduced height of the development in association with the setbacks really mitigate those shadows. And as Councillor Knack pointed out, we're looking at potentially a lesser impact with the reduced height and the larger setbacks, or at very worst, no net impact difference from what would be allowed in the RF1 zone.
Right, or the RF3.
That's correct, yeah.
Because RF3 might typically be, or not unusual to see that sort of application on a lot like this nowadays.
That is a correct assessment.
I wanted to get, and I know this might not be you, Ms. Mickelson, but to parking and traffic concern around the school, which was another concern raised by the community. And do we have somebody on the line that can answer those questions?
Yeah, Mr. Saeed is on the line to answer those questions.
Mr. Saeed, you're there?
Yes, good afternoon, Councillor McKean.
So there's more units than parking spots in this proposal, which I guess could result in the public curb being used for parking by residents of this project. First of all, do you have any sense of what the state of affairs is as far as any parking congestion along the public curb in that part of North Glenora?
Sure. We do have some data that was collected by the applicant, and that reflected around 25-30% utilization of on-street parking along 109 and 139. That said, those percentages will be higher during the school pickup and drop-off, which is understandable and nothing unique.
So that leads me to my next question about your review of any safety impacts to school times for parents and kids attending this school?
So a safety review actually was conducted last year, 2020, and a number of mitigation measures were identified, which included improvements to the crosswalks, zebra mark crosswalks, changing some of the yield signs to stop signs to better address safety concerns at the intersection. All those measures are slated to be implemented this year. I'm not sure if the work has already started, but those are the timelines we have.
For the new school year.
That's correct.
So, and tell me, can you put this into perspective, the amount of traffic at that school versus, I don't know, an average neighborhood in Edmonton? I don't know if this one would be particularly congested with traffic. Do you have any data on that?
Sure. We looked at the data from 2018, and that was available in our inventory, but that reflects about 300 to 400 vehicles per day type threshold along both 139 and 109 Avenue, which is considering the width of these roadways, and those are fairly low volume roads. And I think, unfortunately, that adds to the safety concerns rather than serving any good, because local roads, as per today's standards, are 9 meter wide compared to these roads, which are 11.5 meter wide.
Do you supported this? So is it fair to say that you have no safety concerns about the additional traffic added by this project to the status quo in North Glenora and that school right now?
That is fair to say, and yes, we don't see any concerns going from these 16 units are not going to add any significant burden to the network.
Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, just curious, because understanding, we got all the detail in here about what could be built there under existing zoning and what could be built there under RF3, which clearly is in line with the regs. But I'm looking at what is there right now, and I don't. To my eye, it looks like there's an existing garage that's probably closer to the neighbor than the new building would be. That probably sits around the back of where this building would be at the back, and I'm just wondering how those heights compare. Do we have any, you may not have that information, I'm just curious if you do. It would be interesting to know, just understanding what's going to change even from existing conditions, let alone what's going to change from what would be possible under the zoning.
Councillor Henderson, are you asking about the height of the existing garage on the southern?
Well, the height and the placement, because, I'm looking at an overhead here, and it looks like it would be sitting probably around where this building would finish, and probably is relatively close to the height of the building back there, although it's the new building would be further away from the neighbor, would it not?
It's hard to tell. It's hard to say. I don't have the answer on the exact height
No,
of that.
I wasn't sure you would. I just thought I would ask. I was curious. So, the big difference, so there may not be a lot of difference there. The difference would be there'd be no gap between the garage and the existing building, but a new building could go much further back than the existing one, correct?
That's correct. And then there would be no accessory building in the form of the garage, and then the building itself.
No, but even if it stayed RF1, no one, somebody, the new wall that would face that neighbor would go much further back, I suspect, than the building that's there right now.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, actually, both the neighbors' building on both sides, it goes already much further back.
And based on the adjacent neighbors' front setback, likely the building developed under RF1 would be pushed forward as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I'm not hearing that much about the forward piece. Well, a little bit, but it sounds like the back is the larger issue. And then under RF1, without rezoning, you could put a garage back roughly where it is right now. We don't have anything, we talk about lot coverage, but the lot coverage could be taken care of by the stuff, by having green space to the south, correct, as it is right now. It doesn't speak to the gap between the two buildings particularly, does it? They just can't be attached.
That's correct. It would be attached.
No, but if we're RF1, if it was RF1 under current zoning, the garage could sit pretty much where it is right now. A new building could go much further back. We don't have any, we just said they can't be attached. We don't have, do we have any rules that say how much gap has to be between?
Yeah, under RF1, the rear garage has to be detached.
But what's the gap between them?
You could have a garage building that's sitting very close to where it's sitting currently. You're correct, and it could be much taller because you could have a garden suite associated with that garage as well. And then you would have likely a much longer building for the principal residence.
So I guess what I'm checking is, and I've never asked this question before, I'm just curious, this is reminiscent of the discussion this morning, but do we have any rules right now in an RF1 that actually talk about what the space needs to be between a detached garage and the back of a building?
There is a minimum distance between the rear detached garage and the building.
And what is that? Do you know? I can look it up.
I do know it. I would need to look it up.
Yeah,
right
I can
now.
look it up. That's okay. All right, thanks. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else on the first round? Can I get a motion for a second round,
I'll
please?
move that.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. Seconder? I'll
Second.
Any objections to a second round? Not hearing any. Then on the second round, go ahead, Councillor Knack.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this series of questions, I want to focus on the comment we had. So I'm again referencing the slide of the immediate neighbor who had raised sort of 4 key points: sunlight, density, noise, and then privacy. So from a privacy perspective, I want to compare this to what would be permitted. So either in sense of what is already there for zoning RF1 or what would likely be a supported zone RF3 based off the infill guidelines. In any of those 3, there can still be a window facing that property, correct?
That is correct.
Is there anything that we would have in our standard zone that isn't in here related to privacy? And I think I would primarily focus on the window in that second unit that is still 8.25 meters tall. Because I think the doorways, they're doorways, so they're leading into a hallway, not to a main space. So is there any requirement related to that still under DC?
The requirement in the DC2 right now at 6E is that windows on the north facade be located to minimize overlook into the amenity areas of the adjacent property. So we specifically, we required that there was a specific regulation to deal with the window placement on that north side in the DC2.
And remind me, how would that compare to what could be done in a standard zone? There is a regulation, I think, regarding that, but I just can't remember it off the top of my head, so I'm trying to compare those 2 scenarios.
There is. A development officer would be required to look at window placement and to ensure that there is privacy is protected for adjacent neighbors. But we wanted to make sure that it was specifically called out in this DC2, given that there is additional height from the existing bungalow that's there right now, and then the perception of loss of privacy for that northern amenity area, the North Lot amenity area.
Okay, so similarly, would you define this as sort of identical to what the regulation is in using a standard zone, or slightly more or slightly less, focused on that privacy concern? Do you have a thought on that? I'm just curious how you would view that. Putting it in DC seems to be more firm but it's still a development officer, so I imagine it's sort of being treated the same way, but it's clearly in writing now. Oh, I think you're muted still. So you've probably said something insightful.
Sorry.
You know?
It's hard to say because we don't have an R3 application in front of us, obviously. But it is comparable regulation. So a development, like I said, a development officer is forced to look at ensuring that there isn't overlook into people's yards. Putting this into a DC2 and having it being the will of council put into the DC2 means a development officer couldn't necessarily look at varying the placement of these windows either. So all in all, on balance, I'd say it's pretty equivalent to what's existing in our standard zones, but the developer isn't seeking to vary or to remove a regulation of such in this DC2.
I understand. Okay, that's helpful. There were two other questions that came up from our speakers regarding the building code and fire regulations. The fire regulations, I think, was specifically in relation to the space between the courtyard. That wouldn't, that's not a here question, but there would be a point at which somebody would have to rule on that. It would be circulated to emergency services. This would have been done on the zoning, but is there another check-in point to make sure that is being, if it was approved, that it would obviously follow those things?
Yeah. So once the proponent applies for a development permit, and if that is approved in accordance with the zone, it then goes to building permit stage where a safety codes officer reviews that against building code. And despite a zoning being approved, it would still have to meet all safety code regulations.
Okay. So in summary of what I've heard, I think actually I'm nearing the end. So, okay. No, I think I've asked all the questions I would need to at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions for administration? Just realizing, I'm not sure if I have the speakers list. Oh, okay, I do have an updated speakers list here. So we would now turn to new information. So we have quite a few folks on here. It would be handy if folks could let us know if they have new information by emailing city.clerk@edmonton.ca to just alert us if they want to respond to new information which arose during the public hearing. I'm going to just check with the proponents to start with, Mr. Young, to see if on behalf of the proponents there's any new information you wanted to respond to.
We're just here to answer questions in case there's any additional clarification questions people have, particularly from David Campbell. But other than that, no new information.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, did Mr. Campbell want to respond to something? Or
Hi, Mr. Mayor. Hi, Mr. Mayor. No, I don't need to say anything. I just wanted to make sure that if you did have specific questions for me, that I was available to answer them.
Okay. I should have double checked to see if there were any questions from members of council for Mr. Young or for Mr. Campbell.
I think for Mr. Campbell.
Okay, Mr. Campbell, you're up. Councillor McKean, go ahead with questions.
Quick question, Mr. Campbell. I gather that your group did a sun shadow analysis. And can you speak to, the neighbor to the north talked about a garden and the importance of it. Can you speak to any unusual impact that your project would have on that?
Yeah, sure. Louise brought up sunlight the very first time we talked to her, and we knew that would be something that any neighbor to the north of a project would be concerned about. So as you mentioned, we did the sunlight study, and you have it, and you've been able to see how it compares to RF1 at different times of the year. And administration has said, essentially it's similar to RF1. Sometimes it's slightly better, sometimes slightly worse. But I guess I would say that we really did take the sunlight for Louise's garden very seriously, and I think we designed the project right from the beginning to kind of maximize the sunlight that she would have. I know there's a lot of talk about the position of that one rear unit that we dropped down, and I guess I would say if you look at Louise's garden from Google Earth, most of her garden, or a good chunk of her garden, is at the very back corner, west and south of her lot. And so by moving that one unit farther to the east would actually give more light from the south and from the west at a bunch of times a year. So without rambling on too much, I think we did our best, and we've come up with a pretty good outcome to minimize the impacts on her garden.
Thank you for that. That's it, Mr.
Any other questions for Mr. Campbell? No? Any of the other folks registered in favor? Any of the folks registered in opposition? Last call for new information. Not hearing any.
I'll move closure of the public hearing on, what was item 323.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. Seconder?
I'll second.
Councillor Henderson, okay. Please vote to close the public hearing.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton.
I'm a yes.
Yes,
too.
Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Councillors Paquette and Walters.
Yes, Zadek.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek.
I am having difficulty getting into the correct portal, so put me down for a yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And we're just waiting. Oh, apologies. Just didn't have one clicked off there. We have 13 votes.
Display the vote, please. Carried unanimously.
Mr. Mayor, I will move first reading of item 323 and speak to it.
Thank you. Second?
I'll second, sure.
Councillor Henderson, okay, go ahead, speaking to it, Councillor McKean.
I want to see if anybody else was.
Anybody else before?
I am,
Councillor-
Mr. Mayor, but it won't let me click on.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Knack, and we'll come back to Councillor McKean to close. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and want to again thank everyone for taking the time now to come back for this. There was one of the speakers, and I forgot to write down the name, for those in opposition, who I think correctly identified, in my mind, the biggest consideration, which is that this is truly, because this is a direct control zone, one of the most important factors is the impact on the neighbor to the north. And therefore, what I'm trying to decide is the direct control better or worse or potentially neutral for those impacts that were identified by the neighbor to the north. And there were 4 impacts that were identified in their presentation. And so one of them, density, and I do just want to say this again, which is that I think part of how I'm looking at this is that our residential infill guidelines, since before I was even on council, have typically allowed for an RF3 zone to be built right across the street from either a school or a park. So in terms of unit count, what would likely be approved under a standard zone is identical to what is being proposed here. So that leads me to then look at those other 3 areas that have been highlighted. Noise, and I think this one, it's probably a minor difference, but I would suggest that having the courtyard in between might try to direct more of the gatherings to that point, versus in a backyard where you might have obviously more of it being directed and can be heard. So I don't think it's a huge difference, but I do think there's an argument to be made that noise would be has a potential to be less with the direct control zone. Similarly, on loss of privacy, it sounds like, based off the answers to the questions that we've heard, whether this is an RF3 or an RF1 for that matter, the privacy that we'd be looking at, the impacts of window placement, would be equally dealt with through either the standard regulations, the use of the standard zone, versus what is written into the direct control zone here. So they're written in a similar way. And so I think any new development has a risk. I will just, and I say this from time to time in public hearings, but as somebody that lives on a 3rd story of a 3-story condo building, I think there's oftentimes a fear that comes up, and I understand why it comes up, that will mean we're going to lose all the privacy. And I'll just say, as somebody that does live in an environment like that, last thing I want to do is be looking into the neighbor's backyard. That's not what I do. Even when I'm out on my deck, my small little balcony, I guess. I'm looking up, I'm looking at the trees, I'm looking at the sky. I'm not focused on what's happening in the yard immediately adjacent to me across the alleyway. So I do want to just say that, as I think it's a fair concern that often comes up, and one that I think we should still acknowledge. So that leads me to the last point on the presentation, which was the loss of direct sunlight. And what I see in this direct control zone is a property that's actually being built at lower than the height than even what the original mature neighborhood overlay was first set at. So the original mature neighborhood overlay in 2001 had suggested heights would be at 8.6 meters. It was adjusted just a few years ago because of the building code to 8.9. But this actually writes in the regulations to have it 8.25 meters, and it's further away from the property line. So when I look at either an RF1 or an RF3 zone, that main structure, the tallest part of the structure, is actually further away and a lower height, which leads us to that conversation about that last piece. Here's this attached building, which is 5.5 meters, or a garage, which could be built in the other two zones, which has the potential to be built at up to 6.5 meters. And what I heard through our answers today is that there's probably a marginal difference, but still, this is something that is actually smaller than the other two standard zones. And so when I think about the sunlight and the importance of that garden, which I've heard through the presentation, this direct control actually provides better benefit in that regards. So I'm reminded in closing on this of a recent public hearing where we compare the standard zone versus the direct control, and in my mind, as I go through those identified priorities, the direct control actually looks to be a better overall fit for this area and actually reduces the impacts of what have been identified, the speaker next door. I appreciate not everyone will agree with that, but I think from a planning perspective and from what's actually in that direct control, this is a better solution. So I'm going to support this.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson?
Well, just to follow up on that a little bit, because it's in terms of the residential info guidelines, this is an absolute textbook site for town housing. If you have a look at those guidelines, they could have almost copied the North Glenora layout in terms of the templates that have been put forward to describe a neighborhood, and it makes it really clear that some form of townhousing across from a school and a park site is the place where they should go or could go.
Sorry,
So-
I've got to stop you there. I've just heard from the clerks that in fact there were individuals
Okay.
who did not speak up when I explicitly called for new information,
move to
who would
reopen
like to
public hearing.
offer new information, so I need a motion to reopen the public hearing.
I will so move.
Thank you.
Second.
Moved by Councillor Henderson and seconded. So out of an abundance of caution, the advice is that we should hear the new information before finalizing the decision. So the motion is to reopen the public hearing. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Walters.
It's not coming up for me.
Yes.
There it is. Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. It's just on its way now. Just looking for councillors. Oh, we have all the votes.
Display the vote, please. By unanimous agreement, the public hearing is reopened. I'm going to go back and I'm going to go one by one through each individual on the list to ask if there is new information, just to be crystal clear. Mr. Young and Mr. Campbell, we had already asked. Ms. Campbell, do you have any new information?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Fleshes, do you have any new information?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Gregory, do you have new information?
Nothing new.
Thank you. Mr. Dramanis, any new information? Mr. Dramanis? Understand not everyone may have been able to join us and returned. Aaron Olfeld, any new information? Bernardo Cardoso?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Zvonkovic, any new information?
No new information. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Batten, I understood, could not hear at the beginning and may not have heard the call for new information. But I will ask now, Ms. Batten, can you hear me? Ms. Batten, are you there?
I can see that they're on the meet and may need to unmute.
You're still muted. Try one more time.
Okay, sorry, hello.
Yes.
It keeps muting, but we could not hear any of the information because the system froze. So we missed all of the input from administration, so we don't know if there's new information we wish to bring to, and I don't know whether any of the others on the line experience the same problem.
Okay, well, I'm going to seek advice from the clerks and legal counsel, but my suggestion would be that we need to adjourn this hearing until such time as all the folks registered to speak have an opportunity to review the Q&A on some sort of recording, and then we'll have to come back to checking for new information once they've had an opportunity to solve that technical issue.
Mr. Mayor, I think that's probably prudent. I'm not sure if the clerks can assist us with, is there an available technological option where these folks could go back and review what occurred in terms of questions of administration, so they could see that information as well that council is using in making their decision?
Yes, it is all on YouTube. We are able to rewind the feed there. So if we take a brief recess, we can connect with Joan offline and have her go to the YouTube feed, watch the presentation and questions from council to administration, and then come back to ensure that everyone has had time to review the questions.
Can we move on to the other item in the meantime while that's happening? Or do we need to recess to do that?
I believe we should have enough time if we move on to 3.25, as there are no speakers, and potentially 3.27 as well, as long as no one overlaps.
Okay, then I'm going to suggest that we pause for the purposes of giving all the speakers opportunity to wind back the tape. The clerks will give you instructions for how to do that, to review the information that was presented. Once sufficient time has passed to allow that to happen, we will come back to this item after dealing with one or both of the other two items on our agenda. And if we reach the end of the day, we may have yet to postpone this item further to next week. So we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, though.
Yeah. So, Mr. Mayor, I'll move to postpone 3.23 to the end of the agenda. My questions on 3.25 are very quick. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So to move 3.23 to the end of the agenda for the explicitly for the purpose of allowing folks to review the tape and then inform us if they have any new information. Thank you for that motion, Councillor Henderson. Seconded by Councillor McKean. Who else is done with virtual public hearings? Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. I'm just waiting for.
I'm a yes.
Thank you, Councillor Walters and Councillor Paquette. It just came through here. We have 13 votes. Thank you.
Okay.
Display the vote, and that's carried unanimously. Okay, so we will try to come back to that item today, but now what's up next before us is item 325. Did you want the presentation on it or straight to questions?
I have a fairly simple question.
Okay, since they're your questions, I'm going to pass the chair to Councillor McKean to get us started here. I've just got to take care of something. I'll be right back as quick as I can. So,
Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, so my questions are around the second part of this, and I completely support the instinct that's in here, which sort of says that we can no longer distinguish people who are related or non-related when we distinguish what a household is. I mean, I think that makes sense, because I think, you know, the definition of related, I think, has changed radically, as it should. And it's probably not a fair thing to be adjudicating. My concern is that we have used that as a way of distinguishing between single-family residence and a lodging house. I know in certain areas, in certain neighborhoods, you know, I'm very well aware of it, particularly around the university, this has been an issue. And I'm wondering how we're going to make that distinction now between basically rooming house or, you know, or one dwelling or one household.
Yeah, Councillor Henderson, great question. And as the regulations change, we need to change the way that we enforce things as well to have more of an equity lens on the way that we do enforcement. I believe Ms. Malone can answer the details of how we're changing our approaches.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that we needed to sort out internally as well. How development compliance does enforcement for non-permitted lodging houses, for example, or lodging houses that have a permit that are not complying with their permit, we rely on a number of regulations in the zoning bylaw. So one of them has included the definition of household. So compliance officers have asked to prove their relationships, which has been uncomfortable for the enforcement officers. But we also include the definition, we also look at the definitions of the lodging house, congregate living, and sleeping units. So the combination of the definitions of those other aspects of a lodging house enables us to do compliance and enforcement activities. And then we will also look at the form of the lodging house. Are there locks on the bedroom doors? Are there locks on the kitchen cabinets? And so there's a variety of other aspects we will look at. But we're covered with the removal or the changing of this definition.
It's interesting, because I know, as you probably know, Ms. Malone, you know, I've had a number of issues where in neighborhoods like Garneau, McKernan, around the university, where there's what's being built looks like it's being purpose-built to be shared by, you know, it may have common areas, but it really looks like it's been built for a number of people who would not necessarily be considered a household in the traditional sense, to share accommodation. And I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that, but it has created tension, and it creates other issues with it, which is why I think we have the distinction. So will there be ways, even at the development permit stage, that we'll be able to adjudicate that?
Yes, again, we'll be going back to the definitions in the zoning bylaw for a lodging house. And again, for congregate living and sleeping units. So the development planner will make a decision if it's a single detached home or more used for a lodging house. And then also working with our building codes team if there's any changes or any requirements required through the building code.
Do we think, not that we've had great tools on enforcement up until now on this, but do we think it's going to make it more complicated? I suspect the answer is yes.
Yes, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to look at through the zoning bylaw renewal initiative.
So this is something we could, so this is in your sights, because I was just thinking, having had that conversation this morning, that this is something we maybe need to spend some time thinking about. And quite frankly, I'm not sure, you know, we may be worrying, you know, we need to understand why we would regulate the difference, I suppose, to begin with, which I think is a perfectly valid question. So that is something that's in sight then for your zoning bylaw work?
Yes, it is, and continuing to work with the problem properties team as well as figuring out what enforcement tools and other policies and bylaws are enabled to help with some of the impacts of these developments.
And in the meantime, do you feel you have the tools, or do we need to do something, given that this is now coming out, quite rightly so? Do you have the tools to deal with this until we can have a better look at it?
Yes,
under the existing bylaws. Yeah.
We figured out our decision path in the meantime, so we're confident with the complexity of our bylaw now to cover this off. It's just that what are the next steps with renewal, and what further amendments do we need to make?
Okay, well, thank you for those answers. I thought it was important to raise that, because I suspect you're going to be spending some time working on this in certain neighborhoods, and I suspect Councillor McKean's areas, some of them will have some of the same issues. So Thanks for that, and I'm somewhat assured that you're on top of it. I'm still a little bit worried about how enforced it will be, and I'm glad to hear we're dealing with it under the zoning bylaw. That being said, I'm guessing there's no other questions. I'm happy to move.
Well, I'll check to see if there's any other questions. And I think I'm required to ask if there's any new information. Hearing none.
I will move closure of the public hearing on item 3.25.
Second.
Second.
I think that was Councillor Esslinger who got that. So on closure, please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. Just looking for Councillor Paquette's vote.
I'm a yes.
Thank you. We have all the votes.
Display the vote. That is carried. Thank you.
I will move first reading of item 3.25.
Second.
Thank you. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek.
Have all the votes?
All the votes are in.
Display the vote, please. Thank you. That is carried.
I'll move second reading of item 3.25.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. We have all the votes.
Please display the vote. That is carried.
And I'll move consideration of a third reading of item 3.25.
Second.
Thank you. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. We have all the votes.
Please display the vote. And that is carried.
And I will move third reading of Charter Bylaw 19679.
Second.
Thank you very much. Please vote.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. We have all the votes.
Please display the vote, and that is carried. Next up is question mark?
3.27.
3.27. Thank you. Had you selected this, Councillor Henderson?
I did, and I think we have speakers on it as well.
Oh, okay.
So we should get the presentation.
Yes, we should. If we get the presentation.
Just introductory remarks.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor Iverson and members of council. Today, administration is bringing forward a report to remove the municipal reserve designation from the park located at 10245 82nd Avenue on the southeast corner of White Avenue and Gateway Boulevard within the CPR Irvine neighborhood. Removal of the municipal reserve designation is required to allow the city to enter into a lease for a portion of the site. The site is currently zoned as public park and there's no intention to rezone the property. The parcel is not surplus the city needs and will not be sold. Roughly 1/4 of the site will be leased to a tenant who will have exclusive use of that portion of the land for a 5-year term. The remaining 3/4 of the site will be licensed by the tenant, but will remain open and accessible to the public. The tenant will have the ability to improve the park space following approval of any plans by the city. They will be responsible for all costs associated with any improvements, including removal at the end of the lease if required. The tenant will also be responsible for maintenance of the park for the duration of the lease. Administration supports the removal of reserve designation from the site as the lease allows for the temporary short-term activation of the public space while the city undertakes the work for the Old Strathcona Public Places Plan, which will provide more direction for the long-term strategy and use for the public spaces along White Avenue. Thank you for your time, and we'd be happy to answer any questions after we hear from the registered speakers.
Thank you. First up is Mr. Delaba for questions only. Has that changed, or is that still the case, Mr. Delaba?
Mr. Mayor, questions only from you or administrator or council.
Are there questions for Mr. Delaba? Councillor Henderson, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Delaba, just to get a bit of clarity about, what your current thinking is on this and what you intend to do, because it's staying, there's no intent to rezone from your point of view. It stays as park space, or it stays as everything that's allowed under A zoning, correct?
Councillor Henderson, that is correct. Yes, the zoning public park zone will remain on the site. This formality is essentially just to allow administration or the city of Edmonton to enter into a temporary lease with a private landowner.
So just understanding a little bit more about what your intent is on what you would do with that space, you know, because I think it would still be fully publicly accessible.
Councillor Henderson, that is correct, yes. You know, we took the opportunity with the proposed development of our shipping container on our property immediately to the south. The first intent was to look at finding ways to better connect our site to White Avenue. Obviously, there was this municipal reserve parcel between the avenue and our site, and we thought ultimately at the end of the day there was a means of activating this space more so than what it has been over the last several years, if not more. And so ultimately, when this opportunity came through and through further discussions with the administration, it looked like there was an alignment to allow us to go in there and utilize our own, obviously, private capital to make improvements to the site, enter into a temporary lease, along with some of the conditions of the leases for this site to remain publicly accessible. It's just, I think, exercising some of the, creativity and capital of the private sector to activate this space and I think really help White Avenue in the area with its post-COVID recovery.
So when we talk about activation of the space and perhaps a refurbishment of the space, I mean, there's no intent to change, we've got some mature trees in there. There's no intent to change any of that, correct?
Councillor Henderson, correct. Early on, one of the comments we received back from many members of the public was pertaining to mature trees. So as part of our plan and as part of the lease, those mature trees will remain on site and protected accordingly. So ultimately, at the end of the day, they can continue to thrive.
Now, there are a number of other improvements. I think there's gravel paths and a little bit of lawn and the picnic tables. And the picnic tables, I think, and the bench are fairly heavily used. So your intention with that kind of use?
Councillor Henderson, our intent here is actually to essentially remove all of the surface treatment and replace with some sort of hard surfacing mixed in with seating areas, tables. We're not really looking at occupying a large amount of space for the shipping containers. A significant portion, I think about 80% of the site will remain as open space, but just hard surface to allow for different types of venues. May that be areas where you can have displays, art walks, you can put up tent awnings, that sort of thing at the end of the day to allow it to be used and accessible, very similar to a lot of other public spaces in and around the city, just ultimately tying it in a little bit more with our shipping container development to the south. Really, I think temporarily activating this while the city endeavors in its study on all public spaces in and around these neighborhoods and determines a path forward ultimately at the end of the day. So we figure what a good way to I think help give this area another boost and connect this site to ours. And I think just the whole east side of Gateway Boulevard in general, and maybe help bridge that physical divide that even though the rail tracks are gone, ultimately I think there is this little bit of a psychological gap between 102 Street and ultimately Gateway Boulevard. So we're hoping to better connect the eastern part of White Avenue and the west as well with our improvements.
Just to do a double check though, I mean, because the current use is a kind of passive recreation use of which there's not a lot of places around in that area, but that would still be possible, correct? And would still be encouraged, I presume.
Councillor Henderson, correct. In fact, we are in discussions with the Gateway Boulevard renewal team on the pathway type of, from that park site to the avenue and also tying into our development further to south. So yes, there is an intent to have some sort of very fluid path, maybe for.
I'm thinking more of the benches and the ability to sit and have a bite of lunch or just hang, which is what it's being used for right now. That none of that goes away.
Councillor Henderson, there will be a lot more seating than there currently is under our current proposed plan.
Great. Okay, thanks. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Nicol is next.
How long is the lease for? Councillor Nicol, it is for 5 years.
Why do you need 5 years?
Councillor Nicol, I think, at the end of the day, if we're putting in a fair amount of investment into improving these lands with some hard surfacing, in addition to some of the C-cans, lighting, furniture. I think 5 years does give us a little bit of a period as a payback on that investment. So that is why we've negotiated or have requested a 5-year term on this case.
So explain to me how your payback works and why a 5-year lease on a municipal reserve is appropriate.
Councillor Nicol, I think what this does is this really allows the city to essentially allow the private sector to worry about the operations, maintenance, all while enjoying the benefits of it still being publicly accessible to improve that space. I think we all know the state that it's in. It's been a very poor state considering its very high profile location for a number of years. And I think this was, a smart way of the city partnering with a developer or the private sector to make these improvements. Meanwhile, we know there's a study going on right now through administration.
Mr. DeLava, let's get to the crux of it. What do you define as publicly accessible over a 5-year lease on a piece of private property?
Councillor Nicol, can you repeat that? You did break up a little bit there.
What do you define as publicly accessible, given that we're giving you a 5-year lease on a municipal reserve?
Councillor Nicol, I think that basically it's unencumbered access to the public, no different than the way the current park site operates today. And that is part of our lease negotiations with the city.
So 24/7?
Correct.
And so this is what I don't understand, Mr. DeLava. You have a lease, you're looking for a return on this lease, and you're saying under no conditions that the public will be restricted to the access of this property, even if you might be doing construction on it? So I'm missing, there's something inconsistent here for me.
Councillor Nicol, obviously during construction improvements, the area will be, secured while we will make these improvements. No different than if the city were making improvements to this public space. It's not publicly accessible during that construction period.
So do you have has that plan already been submitted? Has a timeline been submitted? And so on as to the amenity?
Councillor Nicol, those particulars were essentially in negotiations with the lease. Obviously, a big part of the lease moving forward is council ultimately agreeing for this municipal reserve removal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. DeLava? Not seeing any. Dominic McKenzie?
Hey there.
Go ahead.
So this would be my 5 minutes. This is my first time doing this. My name is Dominic McKenzie. I own the Float House just on the other side of the park, and I'm also a resident of White Avenue. I first want to say, I'm happy a group like Belgen is actually coming forward to make an investment and try and improve that corner, because there's definitely a huge opportunity to really welcome people into the city of Edmonton, being the first core that people encounter coming from the airport. My main concern is someone who passes this corner on a regular basis. The primary users of this space is our homeless community. And they often, it's not really much of the public. They're often in the fields lying down, sorting their goods, sitting on the benches. And it is situated in proximity across the street to the main washrooms. So when it comes to these main users, I would be curious from the Belgen Group, how are they going to honor this community and make sure that it's still accessible and convenient for them? So they did mention more seating. That's going to be a benefit. I would also encourage, if there's a possibility to add more shading, especially during one of these warmer times, having a place to have shade or have a little bit of shelter would be good, or block the wind. On top of that, there is no green space left on White Avenue. This is the last green space, and I think it would be nice to kind of maintain that, because it is kind of, I don't know, it seems that we're losing green space in this urban environment. And when it comes to the long-term strategy for that general area, if we go ahead with these developments, we're going to be left with the CP rail yard that's about 30 feet by 600 feet that runs parallel to the Station on White building. And I'd be curious what the city is planning to do with this space, because if we develop it and box it in, it's going to be hard to find a good utility for that space in the future. I know those lands aren't currently, from what I've heard, CP Rail isn't really working well with the city or with developers to gain access to that lands. But I would hope that the plans today would somehow incorporate plans for that large vacant space, because adding this current development is not going to really, like, it will be a nice addition, but it's also going to miss the mark in creating a better corner, because that rail line, that empty space is not really helping the community in any way. And there's a lot more opportunity to make that space even like a larger park. So I would call upon like the city to consider even taking it upon themselves to build this into something even grander, because there is a great opportunity there. And yeah, just with adding a commercial space to that corner, there's going to be little to no access for any type of vehicles to bring any of their shipped goods. Like if they're receiving inventory, they're going to be blocking a gateway boulevard, which gets busy almost at all times of the day. And on top of that, there's not much parking available for that space. I understand that most of it's going to be the foot traffic, but in general, it just seems with the amount of commercial vacancies in this market right now, the lack of access, it's going to be a difficult endeavor to get people like to run a successful business there. But obviously Bell Gen knows what they're doing. They have a lot of great operations in the White Ave area, and I do welcome them coming here to invest money to make that space that much better. But I just want to make sure that our homeless community, which are the main users, if you walk by every day like I do, those are the people using that space. And it is situated so close to the washrooms. And I think we need to strongly consider to make sure that they are protected in whatever plans go forward. And that's all I wanted to share.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. McKenzie? Councillor Henderson?
Yeah, no, and I hear you on the homeless piece, which is why I asked the question about public access and places to sit, because I noted as well that that's a lot of the folks that are using it right now. In terms of I completely agree with you about the railway space, which is why I think this is a temporary answer has some attraction, because CP Rail being who they are, were telling us they could give it to us, they could put it into play tomorrow, or they could be another 60 years. So, understanding that we are still in the planning process for a park actually that goes both sides of White and goes all the way down, that would answer your concern there about the longer term use, correct?
So is that the plan in the future, to have a park that goes right behind the building?
We are in, there is a process, well, there's a process right now that wants to look at the whole, because we have a lot more space as well along there. Yep. Clearly there's a lot more north of White. And there is actively, we're in the middle of doing a planning piece that would understand what the long-term best use of that would be in terms of park space, which is why we're only talking a 5-year piece here, right? It's why the city was not prepared to sell this land or to say what the final use would be. I'm guessing that answers your concern. I just wanted to check it with you.
Yeah, like that sounds good. If there's any participation in like the local community here to kind of get CP Rail to move faster, like there's a lot of business owners that would be excited to see that land. Like,
I hear you, and our plans right now can't necessarily include that piece of the puzzle, but it can include the stuff that we do own, and our ability to take this piece and actually refurbish it, I think would be part of that larger piece of work. That's always been the intention. So I'm guessing that's what you're asking for, correct?
Well, and I kind of thought like with Bell Gen positioning for this piece of land, like obviously they have the resources, they have the experience to really do something pretty fantastic in that area if they were given the whole CP Rail area.
Yeah.
It could be like a huge park and an amazing development that they could create. So
yeah.
If there's any way for people to help kind of get that happening sooner than later, I will do anything I can to help.
You might want to talk to them about it. Believe me, compared to dealing with us, and we're tricky enough, we don't come close to CP Rail. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. McKenzie? Not seeing any. Then Alan Bolstad is next from the Ritchie Community League.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Proceed, please.
Oh, good. Well, I'm here representing Ritchie as the Civics Director for the League, and the board has been looking at this for the past 3 months or so. We've had a couple of presentations from the city representatives and from Bell Gen on this site. This is a picture I took just the other day, so this is the site we're talking about, just right off of White Avenue and Gateway Boulevard. As you see, it's basically a green space now, and that's the concern of the League. The League hates to lose any green space that's still in this general area because there isn't any other. And this is it. When you're looking at city-owned park space in the West Ritchie area, And that area, by the way, is from White Avenue in the north to 72nd Avenue in the south. And from this spot, the rail lines over to 99th Street to the east. There are no other city-owned park spaces in that entire area. And that area has been changing quite a bit in recent years. So that's why I took a few shots just in case people weren't familiar with what was going on. But you can see there's a large apartment block, just that one there. Next to the rail line, it's almost 2 blocks long where lots of people are living now. Just keep moving along with the photos if you could, whoever's handling the photos. And there's a brand new one right across from it on 102nd Street that's just opening up now. As this area changes from what used to be sort of office, commercial to really residential now, or even industrial next to the CPR rail lines and whatnot. Here's another couple of developments that are a little bit older, 4 or 5 years older, but typical of the area. Just keep moving along. Again, another example across the street from it. So the area is really filling up with medium density condos or apartments of one sort or another. There's just another example across the street, a little bit further down. Just keep moving along. Here's a brand new one. Again, this one's just opening up now right next to the CP yards, just on, I guess it'd be might be 80th or 79th Avenue. Here's a little bit older one, closer to 99th Street. And finally, this is the site of where Ritchie's going to be getting its first high rise. This is the spot on 80th Avenue, just a little further down, next to 99th Street, where they're ripping out a few old houses. There's a couple left, and putting up, or the plans are to put up a 12-story high rise. And so you'll be hearing about that shortly. And in that entire area, there's no city park sites. You know, and you might look at that and think, well, that's quite an oversight. How the heck did you ever do that? And, you know, I think it's probably got a lot to do with the fact that it was sort of industrial, commercial to begin with. It wasn't really residential, but now is changing to residential. And so people in the area are quite concerned, including people on the board at Ritchie, which include a couple of members that live in this area, about the availability of green space. So we hate to lose the last spot, which is the spot we're talking about today, next to Gateway Boulevard. What we would like to see is that spot enhanced as a park. If there could be other benches or in days like today, any kind of water feature put in there, that'd be pretty darn nice, and a kind of fountain or anything, etc., would be certainly welcome. But to keep it basically as a bit of an oasis, some green space in an area that has been changing quite dramatically in recent years, with the density going up quite a bit. And so that's why our league voted against the removal of this municipal reserve. We're not confident that in 5 years that the developer is going to want to move, or that the city is going to find money to help him move, or he's going to want to spend money, moving, etc. We're quite concerned once it's gone, and there goes the green space. So that's our position. We would like to hang on to it. If the city was able to come up with other lands, we've talked about that, and we brought that up when we first met with the city about 3 months ago. Keep telling us about this plan, and where are you going to find other land for park space? If you can find a replacement site, great. Let's use that. But until that materializes, don't take away the last one we got. So that's the position of the league. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from Councillor Nicol?
Hi, Alan. And we talked about park inventory not too long ago.
Councillor Nicol, we're having a real difficult time hearing you. If you could get a little closer to the mic.
I'll move my, how's that?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Alan, so at the end of the day, you heard they're temporarily leasing out the MR. As you understand that, correct?
Yeah, but we are pretty skeptical about what's temporary. Who's going to pay to move this stuff in the end? I doubt they'll want to. And if they don't, is the city going to pay for it, or who's going to pay for that?
Yeah, so it's a question of confidence for the community league, correct?
Yeah, once it's gone, it's gone.
Okay. Thank you, Alan.
Councillor Henderson?
Yeah, well, maybe just to follow up a little bit, because I completely sympathize, with the lack of green space, particularly east of there. Ironically, west, I mean, McIntyre Park's half a block away, and that's the space that's probably most heavily used of green space in the area. Further south, there's Light Horse Park, and we have End of Steel there as well. And in terms of new space that we're trying to find, which is, I think, part of the planning that we're expected that would also entail this piece of land, is what's currently right now gravel parking lot between this space and End of Steel. I think the hope is that that can be put into better public space as part of this question. But would that, finding the resources for that clearly is the thing that's held us up, which is why this space is, I think there's been calls for us to fix up this space for quite some time, and it's been put on hold as we have this other discussion. But I'm guessing that larger discussion of a need to take some of those old railway lands that we do have access to, and turn them into park space would come some way to answering the question to the west of the old rail lines. It doesn't solve your problem east of the rail lines. Is that fair to say?
That's right, and that's where the pressure is. That's where so many citizens are moving in now,
Right.
where the population's increasing so significantly, and that's who we're trying to represent, is the people who live in that general area.
So what we really need to go, and this is, what we really need to go looking for is something that actually gives some kind of public space on the other side, on that east side of the old rail lines in behind there, and the Strathcona, what was rethought of as the Strathcona Junction piece. And I can't remember if there was public space thought of as part of that Strathcona Junction conversation. That's a while ago now, and I just don't remember if anything was planned in that West Ritchie piece.
I don't believe so. Not that I recall either. And certainly that would be the interest of the league, as so many more people are living in that area, that there would be an opportunity for parkland if and when CPR ever does decide to vacate some or all of those lands. That's right. But we just don't want to, if you could show us the spot, if you could produce a spot that's now being turned into a lovely park, then we wouldn't feel so bad about this. But
well, I'm pretty confident there will be more park space coming. I'm pretty confident there will be public space that comes as part of that stuff on the other side of White Avenue, literally right across the street. I think more of that will become public space, usable public space, and not just for cars. But that's going to be 3, 4, 5 years down the road, which is why this is just a 5-year piece. And this is absolutely part of that thinking, or should be part of that thinking. So, okay, that's helpful, and thanks for that. I mean, I can't promise you I won't be here to make sure it happens, but I know that's part of the thinking. Great, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Bolstad? Okay, I don't see any. Questions for administration?
Yeah, I'll ask some.
Councillor Henderson, go ahead.
Yeah, just to do a double check, on what the meaning of this is. So this is a piece of land that we are still planning in terms of, is still very much in the mix in terms of that larger piece of work that we've already, there was a motion to move forward on this, which is to understand the open space in this area, correct? And this land is still very much part of that discussion?
That is correct.
Yeah, because, and can you remind me, that all got slowed down a little bit, but can you remind me where that open space planning process is at? Because I think we did fund it.
The old Strathcona Public Places Plan, I believe, it was just refunded, and it's supposed to be kicking off Q4 of this year.
And that will include discussion of this land, and nothing we're doing here today means that will come out of that discussion, correct?
Yes, that's correct, and that is why this is a 5-year lease. It's a way to temporarily activate the space while still leaving it available for what the future strategy comes out of from the old Strathcona Public Places Plan.
And barring that, if we left it where it is, we've recognized for a long time this park needed refurbishment, but barring that, until that plan's done, the city's not going to be refurbishing anything, is my guess.
That's likely correct, Councillor.
Okay. So, I'm just curious. I mean, I can't remember if there's anything in the Strathcona Junction plan for that, it's sometimes called East Strathcona and sometimes called West Ritchie. That area, the 81st Avenue area on the to the east of the tracks. Was there anything in there? Because I think it is probably something that somebody needs to have a look at, that has a look at public space in that area.
I may throw this one over to Mr. Churchill from Open Space to answer, but I do believe there's a park planned in the ARP in the southwest corner of 81st Avenue and 100th Street.
Okay, yeah, I'd be surprised if we missed it. It's just been a long time since I looked at that ARP. Because I think that's a completely valid question that would probably answer the question, would be a better answer to the problem that's being raised by the Ritchie Community League than the space we're talking about right now, because it actually is not cut off by that big long building and by the railroad tracks, correct?
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. That is correct. The Strathcona ARP does identify acquisition for a public park within the West Ritchie sub-area of the Strathcona ARP. We have this site identified within the mature area acquisition profile, and we'll continue to work to acquire that site.
And will that be part of the open spaces discussion as part of the larger Strathcona plan as well? Or is that separate?
I believe that is a separate discussion.
Yeah, I would have thought so. Okay, great, thanks. I think that's, and I don't know if we're allowed to ask questions about what the lease looks like right now, or that might be out of scope for this. But maybe I'll ask and I can be ruled out of order. So in terms of the expectation of what happens at the end of 5 years, if we decide not to renew the lease, what do we, to Mr. Boltsad's concerns about who has to pay to put it back? How does the lease speak to that? I'm guessing there's some improvements that would be non-problematic and other improvements that would be. So do we know what the lease says?
Is reversion in bounds, Ms. Inkpen?
Yes, this is in bounds, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, the expectation from the lease would be that the land, if required, is restored back to its original condition.
By them and not by us?
By them, yeah, at their cost.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Nicol is next.
Thank you very much. To administration, what surety has been given to public access to the property as part of this lease?
Councillor, so roughly 1/4 of the site is actually going to be leased. So they plan on using CCANs as part of their redevelopment or development of the site. The footprint of the CCANs is actually what's going to be leased. The remainder of the land is going to be licensed. So it's still city-owned, fully accessible public land that they're just permitted to do improvements on, but still owned and accessible to the city.
Am I understanding you correctly? You're leasing out 1/4 for a laydown site, and that can continue on for 5 years, and then there's access to 3/4 of the site for that same time period?
Correct.
So the question then becomes, have you that 1/4 of the site as that will be permanently shut down for 5 years?
They will have exclusive use of that lease area for 5 years, yeah.
So technically, they could shut it down for 5 years under the lease agreement that you've worked on.
What do you mean by shut it down, Councillor?
Well, if it's leased and it's in their hands and they need a laydown yard, right? It strikes me that they could exercise that right for up to a 5-year period as a permanent for that lease, because we've just given them the rights to that quarter.
Technically, they will have exclusive use of that land. I don't know if they would be using it as laydown space for that 5-year period. I do believe it's part of their business model to use that space as a area that can generate revenue. But that might be a question better suited for Mr. Dulaba.
An area that can generate revenue. Okay, that's an interesting phrase for a park. Okay. Has any plans been submitted with regards to the improvements or the value of the improvements given the conditions of the lease? I'm not asking, I'm not asking for amounts. As I'm looking at Ms. Inkpen, but I'm asking if there's any, what has the considerations been put on the table and negotiated with administration?
I believe concept plans have been submitted and the lease is being negotiated right now. I don't think a development permit or anything like that has been submitted yet, so.
Oh, okay. So you have not, the lease is subject to this zoning hearing, that would be clear?
Yeah, the city's not able to lease land that has a reserve designation on it. That's why the reserve removal is required to facilitate the lease.
Temporary reserve removal.
Temporary, for a temporary lease.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Any other questions for administration? How about new information? Somebody's got a siren in their background. I don't know if they could mute maybe. If you hear a siren, which might be everybody. No. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, new information then. Mr. DeLaba, do you have any new information?
Mr. Mayor, no.
Thank you. Mr. McKenzie, any new information?
No new information, but I would just like to understand if within the lease, there's going to be any particular items pertaining to the homeless community. Like, is there going to be anything to address, like, because if it's going to be for revenue generating purposes, I can imagine as a business, they're not going to want to have, like, that may interfere in what they may be trying to do, but it's also going to be a dishonor to the people that are primarily using that space. So is there going to be anything incorporated in there to improve that space for these primary users?
Thank you for sharing that observation. It's not really a Q&A format, but we're registered and heard your inquiry around that. So,
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. McKenzie on his rhetorical question? Well, we appreciate your curiosity, and but I see no questions for you, Mr. McKenzie. Thank you. Next is Mr. Bolstad. Any new information?
No, I don't have any, thank you.
Thank you. Any other new information or questions arising from the new information? Not seeing any. Councillor Henderson?
I will move closure of public hearing on item 3.27.
Seconder?
Second.
Councillor Banga, seconds. Okay, thank you. Please vote to close public hearing.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. One moment, it's just loading. Just waiting for Councillor Katarina's vote. Oh, there, it just came through. We have 13 votes.
That's carried unanimously. That's just to close public hearing. Go
And
ahead.
I will move the recommendation under 3.27.
Second.
Thank you. Recommendation's been moved.
And I'll speak to it really quickly, if that's okay.
Speaking to it, go ahead, Councillor
Yeah,
Henderson.
I don't think I'd be supporting this if this was a permanent answer to this space. But I think this is a piece of land that is looking a little bit sad right now. And if this allows us to leverage somebody else's efforts to make it a more vibrant public space again, and pep it up a bit, I think that's to our advantage. I take the question about the population that is using the space right now, which is why I asked the question of public access, because I think that's true of all of our public spaces, and we need to make sure that when we say public, we mean everybody. But the fact that it's still considered public space and protected by us as public space, I think answers that concern. But I think there's a really, really important question here about the long-term needs in this area and the long-term use of this space, which I think are also answered by this, but I don't see those being answered definitively in the next few years. And I think in the meantime, if this allows it to be a happier piece of land in the area, it's of benefit to the community. So, I would hope that coming out of the study that we've already funded, a longer-term answer will be addressed. So I'm prepared to support it.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak? Not seeing anyone, then please vote.
waiting for Councillor Zadek.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek. We have all the votes.
Display the votes, please. That's carried 12-1. Okay, next is back to new information, if we're ready for it, on North Glenora. And to the best of our knowledge, have the parties had an opportunity to review the tapes?
Yes, and everyone has been contacted via email to ensure that they have had time and the link to view the questions and answers.
Okay, I will go back then, starting with Ms. Batten, to see if she wishes to respond to any new information. Ms. Batten, are you there?
They are on the meet and may need to unmute.
Ms. Batten? Okay, we'll see if, we'll give you a moment. I'll carry on with the other speakers here. Louise Humke, do you have any new, do you wish to respond to any new information which arose during the public hearing concerning this item?
Okay. You put your camera on too if you want.
Ms. Humke?
Where's that? This one? No, right here. This one, no, right here. Yeah.
Do you wish to respond to any new information, Ms. Humke?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
I was referring to when we last met, you were talking to me about the sunlight and how is it important to me. But my response is, the thought of 6 residents next to me and the mass of the building are more concerning. This proposal is 48% site coverage with no landscaping or green space. And yes, I would prefer that it is allowed in the RF3 zoning to this proposal.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Humke? Not seeing any. I'll loop back to Ms. Batten. Ms. Humke, if you could mute yourself again, just to cut down on the echo. Ms. Batten, are you there? Can we give Ms. Batten a phone-in number, maybe? Or
Yes, we can do that as well. It had been indicated to our office that their concern was addressed in the questions of administration. However, we can reach out one more time to see if we can get them on the line.
just to hear if we can, but that's probably sufficient comfort in writing that that they've had the opportunity to view what they needed to and don't have further comments. So we'll take that at face value, having made all these accommodations. If that changes though, Ms. Batten, please reach out and let us know once you've heard from the other folks here, if anything else arises, presuming you can hear us now. Ms. Sprague, do you have any new information?
I don't believe she is on the meet, but we are reaching out to her as well.
Okay, how about Donna Chinasic? Any new information? How about Darlene Elias or Elias? Any new information?
Yes, I'm here, thank you. One of the issues that was discussed today was that this proposed development, as repeatedly discussed as row housing, which by city standards it is not, because two of the units face the neighbor to the north. Now RF3 deals with row housing, and if it was RF3 zoning, then we wouldn't have any objections. Because RF3 does not allow for a solid mass to be built from the front of the street to the back of the street. So I'm a little confused as to why we're still calling it row housing, which comes under RF3 and not DC2.
Again, it's not exactly a question and answer session, but we hear your question. And if you have other points you want to raise in the allotted time here,
Okay.
the time
Sure.
is yours.
And the other concern that I have, that I don't think, I think it is new business, is that a large selling feature of this project has been that it will provide passive certified housing. Now, if this is passed, with reference to the passive certified housing, will that be a requirement of this development, of this proposal, if it's approved? And if it is, at what percent? 80%, 90%?
Again, it's not a dialogue session. You can register any questions or concerns that you have in this time, but there isn't really an opportunity for back and forth here in new information. There may be
All right,
follow-up
thank you.
questions for you, though, or questions following up from council on the new information that's presented. So is there anything else you wanted to register with us at this time?
No, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Elias? Not seeing any. Is there new information from Ann Swist?
It's not exactly new, but when you had somebody just talk about the parking again, they said that we said that this traffic review done by the applicant was done when the pandemic was on. So of course there was a lot less of traffic. However, the person from the city said they also looked at it in 2018. In 2018, the kitty corner from this applicant, or this two houses, was the patio homes that had 14 people living there with 14 parking spaces. And it was not yet approved for the patio homes that are now going to turn into a four-story apartment with 45 people and only 15 spaces. So this is a change that was not there in 2018, and it was not addressed in this current parking. And that's the only comment I have.
Thank you, Ms. Swist. Any questions? Seeing none. Ann Mole? Any new information?
We're reaching out to her as well.
How about Robert Stevenson? Any new information?
And we're reaching out to him as well, just to triple check.
Okay, and Kathy Monson, any new information?
Yes, there was just one thing that I was curious on. As we talk about the setbacks on the north being 3 meters, it appears in what I'm seeing that the parked cars, they're not set back that 3 meters. Is a setback not a setback for the whole proposal? And that was my question.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Monson on the new information? Not seeing any. Any questions arising from the new information that require clarification? Not seeing any. The motion to close, we'll need a fresh motion to close public hearing then.
I believe that may be Joan Batten on the phone
Ms.
there.
Batten, did you have any new information?
Yes, I'm sorry about all the computer problems. It's my understanding that Councillor Henderson spoke about the residential infill guidelines and how he felt this was an ideal location for this particular project. But it's my understanding from the guidelines that 6+ units should be located along the edges of a neighborhood and adjacent to an arterial roadway, which is not the case on this project. Would I be able to get the input on that particular item?
Again, there isn't really an opportunity for dialogue in the new information. So you can register all the issues that you would like us to consider that have arisen that you wish to draw to our attention.
I see. Okay, so we just address our concerns, and they address their approval of the original development. Is that correct?
The purpose of new information is for you to respond to any issues which arose during the public hearing that you think
Right.
require further discussion, or issues
Right.
that you wish to raise in response to something that was raised by someone else. Essentially, you can flag those for us. Councillor
Yeah.
Henderson has just indicated that he will ask you a follow-up question here. So you've got another 3.5 minutes, though, to flag anything you would like all members of council to hear before the public hearing concludes. And again, Councillor
Okay.
Henderson has indicated he will ask you a question in a moment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Henderson?
Well, just maybe, I don't know if I can, I'll try and do this in the form of a question to see if it
I will
answers your
provide
concern.
wide latitude.
Yeah, because unfortunately, I was interrupted halfway through what I was saying, because that was the point where we interrupted the public hearing to go back. So I really didn't get to complete my thought. This is an unusual situation where we make our closings and then go back. But maybe I can do a double check back with administration, but the residential infill guidelines make it fairly clear, I wasn't talking about the number of units, but make it fairly clear that townhousing as a kind of form are appropriate around a park and in the center of a neighborhood like this. It was the one place where it was considered appropriate outside of the edges of the neighborhood. And that was the point that I was making. And that, I don't know if that helps, but I wasn't speaking to the number of units. It was around townhousing as a form and a reference to the residential infill guidelines that right from day one have always said that this was one of the places we should consider them. I don't know if that helps you, does it?
It does a little, Councillor Henderson, but you're deeming this to be a townhouse as
No, I
opposed
wasn't
to...
making that point. I was saying that if that was in front of us, there'd be no debate here. I didn't get to finish my point as part of speaking, so I just wanted to say that that's the starting place that we're coming from. But that the residential infill guidelines give us direction that would say that townhousing is completely appropriate in this space. I'm not suggesting that that's what we should do or not do. It just was a starting place. Does that help?
I guess so. But because it's not a townhouse and it's
I wasn't
6+
suggesting it
units
was.
and it's
Yeah.
No, I understand. Thank you for your further input.
Any other questions for Ms. Batten? Not seeing any. Any other new information? Going once.
When Councillor Knapp talked about how
I'm
he
sorry, Ms.
felt...
Batten,
sorry.
you wish to offer another round of new information?
Or
are you still responding? Are you still responding to Councillor Henderson's question?
No, not to Councillor Henderson.
Okay, I'm going to need to call a whole new round of new information then before I come back to you, Ms. Batten. So stand by, please.
Yes,
before I do
certainly.
that, I need a motion to extend to complete this
We
item.
extend to complete this item.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor McKean. Please vote. We are close, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillors Zadek and Walters. I'm just waiting for Councillors Banga and Hamilton.
Okay.
I'm a yes.
Thank you, Councillor Banga.
Display the vote, please.
Apologies, still waiting for Councillor Hamilton's vote.
Sorry. Councillor Hamilton, are you there? If we got 12, call the vote.
Sorry, I lost connection for a minute. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, welcome back. Thank you. And you're in the affirmative?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Display the vote. Carried unanimously to extend orders to complete this item. Okay, so Mr. Young, any new information?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Campbell, any new information?
Nope.
Thank you. Ms. Campbell, any new information?
No information, new information.
Thank you. Mr. Fleshes, any new information?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Gregory, any new information?
Nothing new, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Dramanis, any new information? Ms. Olfelt, any new information? How about Mr. Cardoso?
No new information.
Thank you. Mr. Vonkovich?
No new information.
Thank you. Ms. Batten, under new information,
Yes.
you have up to 5 minutes to respond, preferably to new items that have come up, and this will be, again, your opportunity to flag any remaining issues for council's consideration, preferably arising from the public hearing.
Okay. Thank you. And my question would be to Councillor Knack. He had responded to his feeling that there was not going to be a lack of privacy or a lack of light, but did not address the issue of no green space. Would it be possible for him to express his views on that?
I've already stretched the rules
Again,
once,
I
Ms.
know.
Batten, so you can flag that you are left with some ambiguity after that line of questioning. That's fair
Okay.
to flag, but again, the purpose of the new information is not.
Yes, to dispute or address what was previously addressed. Okay, thank you very much. That would be all that I have to bring forward.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Batten on that? Okay, not seeing any. Ms. Humke, any new information? Ms. Sprague?
Yeah. Sorry. I just can't believe where we're going with this. Is this the end? Are we going to have a chance to have dialogue, more dialogue?
You're getting the last word here. So we are at the stage of the process where, as I outlined in my remarks at the beginning of the public hearing, where there is the opportunity for each speaker to respond to new information which has arisen during the course of the public hearing, in addition to the previous opportunities you've had to register your questions and concerns for council to consider. So it is a quasi-judicial public hearing, which is not, though it is informal at times, it is bound by certain provincial laws that set out a process which is still fairly formal. And we are at the stage in the process where the registered speakers have now a second opportunity to respond to new information. So that is the stage we're at, and then council may close the public hearing and debate based on everything that we've heard from all parties.
Thank you. I hope everybody has heard all the concern.
Thank you. That's the purpose of the hearing. Any questions for Ms. Humke? Not seeing any. Ms. Sprague, any new information?
She has indicated to our office that she does not wish to speak.
Okay. Ms. Chinazik, any new information? Ms. Elias?
None, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Swist?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mole?
We were unable to reach Ms. Mole.
Mr. Stevenson?
He has indicated that he does not want to speak.
And Ms. Monson?
No, I have nothing further.
Thank you. I can now entertain a motion to close the public hearing, having safely heard from everybody thoroughly.
I will move closure of the public hearing on item 23.
Thank you.
And I will second it.
Councillor McKean, seconded by Councillor Henderson. Okay, please vote to close the public hearing.
I'm a yes, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Councillor Walters. I'm just waiting for Councillor Henderson's vote.
Sorry, it's not coming up. There we go.
Thank you. We have 13 votes.
Display the vote. Carried. First reading was on the floor previously, and that's still on the floor. So we can carry on speaking to it. Councillor Henderson, I believe you have about 4 minutes left.
Maybe just to finish the point that I was trying to make, understanding, and we've, and it's to following up on Councillor Knack's point that, that so much of what we're struggling with in these circumstances, particularly with flanking situations, which this isn't, this is effectively a mid-block in terms of its relationship to the neighbor, which I think is the primary concern here. But in terms of the trade-offs between, I think, what this DC2 gives, understanding that what we'd be looking at here, other than that, would be a built form that would have probably a longer wall, a taller wall, albeit, and it would be closer to the neighbor. In terms of the light, I recognize that you're going to have two entrances, and where you would probably only have, well, you're going to have three entrances on that side, one of them fairly far to the front, one in the middle, and one in the back, where probably in a different situation you would have two. So, and that may create some privacy concerns. But the other privacy concerns would be created by, just as equally, by an RF3 or a townhouse situation, and it might well have a side door, and it would have all the same kind of windows and a taller wall. So the one thing that I think is a little bit different is that the wall is continuous, and that's the trade-off. So I went back and had a look. If you were going to do another building behind, a garage behind, that could have a secondary suite in it and therefore be much taller than the building that's being looked at, you would have had to have a 2.4 meter gap between them, which is about 6 feet. And to me, that's the trade-off between that we can guarantee with this direct control against a situation that I think could be much worse and that we could give no guarantees, which a building that would be taller, probably move further back, would probably have a garage that was back there and had more height, that would cast probably more shade and might create all the same issues with privacy. And the trade-off is that you get the lower building at the back, you get a slightly lower building even at the front, and you get a significantly increased side yard. So, understanding we keep on struggling with these questions and have done some things with standard zoning that I think are probably far more invasive. I understand why this change is alarming, but I actually think in terms of the guarantees that we can get out of this direct control, that in terms of the issues that have been raised to us today, this is a proposal that has worked really hard to mitigate those concerns that we always struggle with in these situations. So, recognizing nothing is ever perfect, and there isn't going to be a break in that wall, and that's the one thing that gives me some hesitation. But I think that's traded off against the lower height and against being further away from it being stepped back significantly, almost double, more than double distance from the neighbors. So I will support this.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Could you take the chair?
Happily so.
Thank you. So, having listened carefully to perspectives from community members who are concerned about the impacts, particularly adjacent property owners, and thinking about particularly about what is permissible today on the site, which is a fairly large building adjacent as it is. I think this proposal makes artful use of what would otherwise be a lot of underutilized space on the site where it has less of an impact. And to the extent that there is some impact, that's mitigated by the height transitions and the design considerations. Again, these are things that conventional zoning wouldn't allow for, and even as we spent a good chunk of the morning, and I was listening carefully to the input on the zoning bylaw discussion, conventional zoning can't capture these kinds of mitigations, and so direct controls are challenging for applicants and challenging for community because they drive a level of specificity that is both adds to the clear sense of what's coming that's different, but also certainty about what's expected, that all can be held accountable to, particularly the developers. And from the developers, I see a significant attempt to hear and respond to community feedback, as well as an honest attempt to define some different kinds of housing options in a community that is ready for density, on a site that's ready for redevelopment, in an area where it seems suitable to cluster, given the context, and particularly the school and the park and other amenities nearby, again, consistent with the spirit of the old residential infill guidelines, but even more importantly, consistent very much with the goals of the city plan. And so a tough one, and to some degree having the specificity of the DC sort of makes it more concrete, as it were, what those impacts might be. But again, I think the mitigations are very fair and again, artfully and responsively articulated in the context of the community feedback, and so I'll obviously be supporting the application before us here today, and you know, asked to reflect on the question often, you know, how would you feel about living next to this? I think we need to live next to a lot more of this level of innovation and this level of community engagement behind it, and not from a land use perspective, but from a community development perspective, engagement from builders clearly committed to improving communities and creating homes that enhance a sense of community. So you know, I think about a city 10 or 20 or 30 years from now that has a lot more different kinds of things like this, and that doesn't happen without council saying yes in these circumstances, notwithstanding that it comes with fear and, albeit with a DC, less uncertainty, but the pressure of change. But our city is changing, and I think this is one of the indications I feel very comfortable pointing to as a positive indication of that kind of change. So I'll support what's before us here today and leave it there. I'll take the chair back and go to Councillor McKean.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. The three speakers before me, I thought, handled the technical details and arguments really well of how the potential was for other forms of redevelopment to go in here and have similar or maybe even more impact in regards to the next door neighbor. But you know, that's not really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about North Glenora. I may not get this opportunity again as I'm not running for council. I'm really proud of this community for many different reasons. I think the first obvious one was I got to brag to my colleagues about North Glenora being a YIMBY community when you went through all the hard work to allow the development of subsidized housing for large newcomer families. And that was a project that took quite a while, but I was really touched by that. And that came at the same time that the school was under threat, and I know there was another affordable housing project, perhaps a more controversial one, that was sort of waiting in the wings too. And I just thought North Glenora handled that with real grace. And then I remember attending an event where putting together food hampers for Syrian refugees who'd come to our city, and the enthusiasm that was being done. But there's just a kind of a, when you go to a neighborhood, there's a kind of a feel to the place, and it's the mixed demographics in there, but it's the kids playing in the park. I was always made to feel real welcome. And I don't know if it was Kathy or Darlene invited me out last summer to a backyard meeting where they wanted to raise concerns about this project, and I walked into the backyard and it felt like there was like 100 people sitting around. There weren't. I don't remember the exact number, but you know, as an elected official, you walk into those situations and you sort of gulp a little bit, not knowing how you're going to be treated. But I was treated with complete respect and kindness in that situation. And we talked a lot about the development. And we saw them come forward over this period of time in this hearing and register their worries and concerns and complaints. And I guess the thing that bothers me a little bit, I will be supporting the development, I think, for the technical reasons that were already outlined, and the fact that I think it's a really innovative, interesting project brought to a community by people in the community, which I can't disregard. I guess what I'm a little bit bothered about is there seems like there's a bit of a family squabble in North Glenora, the community that I bragged about for legitimate reasons that I think are still there. So if I had a wish for North Glenora, and one of the questions we had from one of our last speakers was about dialogue. And I would really encourage the proponents of this and the opponents of this to break bread and find ways to get past this discord, because it doesn't feel right in your community to me. And I know the quality of the people on both sides, and I'm quite confident you can do that. And I think the project will turn out to be an asset for North Glenora. I really do. And we heard that there's some of the safety concerns of we can deal with parking. We've dealt with parking in many neighborhoods like Oliver, where it's super congested. Believe me, we can deal with that fairly to make sure that people's interests are looked after. So again, I will be supporting this. Hate to disappoint some of the people, but I really hope, as I said, you'll continue talking to each other, continue having your social gatherings in the hall, which, you know, we all hope will return now with COVID abating. Anyways, I just want to conclude by thanking everybody, whether it's Ryan and his group or Kathy and your group. I think you made this a challenge for us, and that's kind of the point. It's hard to make these decisions, and you helped us make it, but it wasn't comfortable. So thanks to all of you, and thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Please vote on first reading.
Just waiting for Councillors Banga and Zadek.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Zadek.
I'm good to go, yes.
Thank you, Councillor Banga. We have 13 votes.
Display the vote. Carried unanimously. Second reading?
Mr. Mayor, I'll move second reading of 323.
Second.
Please vote.
Just waiting for one more vote. Perfect. I have 13 votes.
Display the vote. Carried unanimously.
Move consideration of third reading on the item.
Second.
To allow third reading to proceed, please vote.
We have 13 votes.
Display the vote. Carried.
Mr. Mayor, I will move third reading of Charter Bylaw 19746.
Second.
Third and final reading, please vote.
We have 13 votes.
Display the vote. Carried. Are there any notices of motion today? Hearing none, this public hearing is concluded.